Within the last hour, sources close to the investigation have confirmed new details about the death of retired film producer Walter Kessler and his wife Elena, found inside their locked estate outside Santa Fe. What started as a routine welfare check has turned into something federal investigators refuse to explain. Nobody expected any of this. When county deputies arrived at the secluded Kessler property on a cold February morning, the case looked simple. 2 elderly people, dead inside a home locked from the outside. Tragic, yes. Complicated? No. The kind of situation that generates a few hours of paperwork and a quiet press release by evening. Within hours, everything changed because sitting open on a desk in Walter Kessler's private library was a laptop. And when investigators looked at what was on its screen, they didn't close the case, they escalated it. They called in federal resources, they extended the search deep into the surrounding property, and then they went completely silent, refusing to confirm, deny, or explain a single detail about what those files contained, or why 2 deaths that looked like natural causes needed the FBI at all. Walter Kessler was 93 years old. He died in his own home. That should have been the end of the story. So why won't investigators talk about what was on that laptop, and what did they find underneath his house? Everything you're about to hear is a fictional story, inspired by the kind of hidden history mysteries that keep turning up in quiet corners of the American Southwest. But stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that iron door changes everything. It was a handyman who made the first call. He had been trying to reach the Kessler estate for nearly a week. Phone calls went unanswered, messages disappeared. The household that had operated with quiet, organized precision for years had simply gone dark. No explanation from inside, no response to any contact from outside, just silence from behind walls that had always been difficult to see past. Deputies drove out along a long stretch of dirt road cutting through the foothills of northern New Mexico, where pinon and juniper trees pressed in close on both sides, closing off the sight lines so completely that the main house didn't come into view until you were nearly at the front gate. Neighbors in the area had long described the Kessler property as one of the most private in the region, a deliberate choice in a part of the state already known for the discretion of its wealthy residents. When deputies reached the perimeter, the gates were locked, and that single detail shifted the tone of the whole visit before the investigation had even officially begun. This was not a property where anyone accidentally left the entrance unsecured. Reinforced fencing, cameras at every corner, controlled access points that had clearly been designed with real intention. Deputies cut through and stepped onto the grounds, and the silence there was complete. No vehicles moving, no staff, no motion behind any of the windows. The residents stood among the trees in a way that felt less like the privacy Walter had always preferred and more like something had simply stopped. Officers moved toward the main house, made their way inside, and found the bodies of Walter Kessler and his wife Elena. Officers found Elena, 68 years old, in an upstairs bathroom. Walter, 93, was found near the kitchen, close to the front door. The medical examiner later determined that Elena had died first from a sudden respiratory illness, the kind that occurs occasionally in the high desert environment of the American Southwest and is documented in the region every year. Walter died several days later from heart failure, with a note in his file that early-stage memory decline may have kept him from fully understanding what had happened to his wife. Investigators believed he had lived alone in that house with her for nearly a week before his own heart finally gave out. On paper, this looked like tragedy, plain and simple. But the investigation did not stop there, because when the forensic team began sweeping the property, one of the first things they noticed was that laptop, sitting open, screen still glowing faintly, on the desk in Walter's private library. They didn't know yet what was on it. They didn't know yet what the library itself was hiding. But they flagged the device immediately, and whatever they found on that screen is the reason this case stopped being routine before the first day was even over. After stepping away from producing films decades earlier, Walter Kessler had spent his final years almost entirely inside that one room. Friends who had visited the estate over the years consistently described the library as the true center of the house, the place where Walter spent nearly all of his waking hours, which made it the very first place investigators searched. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. Tall shelves lined every wall, antique furniture arranged carefully under warm lighting, first edition sitting beside heavily annotated research books, loose manuscript pages tucked between chapters. The shelves were packed with material on American history, Cold War-era infrastructure, military biography, and what looked like detailed notes on classified government construction projects across the Southwest. Nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but as investigators moved carefully through the space, they started noticing small details that didn't fit the picture of a room used simply for reading. Certain books had clearly been pulled and replaced out of order, sitting in positions that broke the logic of the surrounding shelves. A heavy upholstered chair had fresh drag marks across the hardwood floor, as if it had been moved recently and with some urgency. Several drawers sat slightly open in the specific way that suggests someone had searched through them quickly and never bothered closing them properly. Dust patterns across certain shelves were uneven, consistent with specific items being pulled out and then returned. Someone had clearly been working in that room, and recently, and they had not been careful about hiding it. Then investigators turned back to the laptop, the browser history, the folder structure, the files sitting open right there on the desktop. Whatever Walter had been researching in his final weeks was specific, organized, and methodical in a way that suggested sustained, deliberate effort rather than casual curiosity. The medical timeline was already clear. Elena and Walter had died roughly a week apart, and the research on that laptop had clearly been going on for a long time before either of their deaths. Investigators began cross-referencing what was on the screen with the subjects filling the shelves around them. Underground construction projects across northern New Mexico, classified federal programs from the middle of the 20th century, subterranean infrastructure connected to a decades-long stretch of secretive government development in the region. The research did not read like background material for a book or a hobby. It read like someone trying to confirm something they had already found. And that's when one of the investigators noticed something strange about the wall behind a section of bookshelves. The wooden paneling didn't sit perfectly flush with the surrounding frame, a tiny inconsistency, the kind of thing you could walk past 1,000 times and never register until you actually see it, and then it's impossible to unsee. A closer look revealed a small mechanical trigger built directly into the wooden frame, hidden behind a row of books, positioned at exactly the height of a seated man's hand. When investigators activated it, a section of the wall shifted inward with the smooth, precise motion of something engineered rather than improvised. Behind it was a narrow stone staircase, descending straight down into darkness. Nobody on that team knew what was waiting at the bottom. The staircase dropped steadily, and the air changed within the first few steps. Cooler, heavier, carrying that faint metallic smell of rust mixed with the specific dampness that builds up in stone that hasn't seen daylight in decades. Flashlight beams swept across rough, uneven surfaces as the team moved down. What the tunnel told investigators about itself was that it wasn't one single construction. It was several, built across different eras and layered on top of each other. The upper section showed clear modern reinforcement, concrete supports, steel bracing, electrical conduit lines half embedded into the walls, as if someone had started wiring the passage properly and then simply stopped partway through. The work was competent, but unfinished. Below that, the material changed completely. The lower stonework was hand-cut, chisel marks instead of machine tooling, irregular joints between the blocks, the kind of uneven spacing typical of early 20th century excavation rather than anything built after the Second World War. Engineers who later reviewed photographs of the structure concluded that the lower sections had almost certainly been built decades before the house standing above them, possibly as early as the very first years of the last century, long before this land had ever been developed into a private residential estate. Let that sit for a moment. The tunnel beneath Walter Kessler's library may have already existed long before he ever moved in. Someone else built it. Someone else reinforced it later. Someone else concealed the entrance inside, what would eventually become his private study. And at some point across that long chain of owners and decades, someone made sure that laptop on the desk above it would end up containing a detailed record of what that tunnel actually meant and where it led. Northern New Mexico has a well-documented history of underground construction. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, subterranean chambers were routinely built beneath homes, ranches, and trading outposts across the territory, mostly for temperature-controlled food storage and shelter from the extreme desert weather cycles. The local geology, volcanic tuff, and compacted earth made this kind of excavation far more manageable than in most other parts of the country. Early prospectors carved exploratory shafts across the landscape. Some were later repurposed, some were reinforced and absorbed into expanding properties as ownership passed down across generations. Some simply disappeared from memory and public record altogether. But the lower sections of this particular tunnel did not look like a root cellar or a storm shelter. They looked like the beginning of something built for a very different purpose, something that continued much further. The staircase didn't end at a blank wall. It ended in a room, and what was inside that room is why federal investigators reportedly stayed on the property for days after the deaths had already been quietly explained away in the official paperwork. The chamber at the base of the tunnel looked less like storage and more like a place where information had been deliberately buried and then sealed shut. Old wooden crates lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Some had collapsed under their own weight over the years, spilling their contents across the stone floor in piles that had clearly been sitting undisturbed long enough to gather their own thick layer of settled dust. Others remained intact, their lids warped and darkened with age, but still structurally holding together. The room carried the quality of a place that had once been organized with real precision and then closed off and left alone for a very long time. Inside the crates, investigators found documents, photographs, and metal instruments spanning what appeared to be multiple distinct eras. Several photographs were dated to the early part of the last century. Groups of men gathered around tables covered in maps and technical drawings, dressed in the formal dark suits and heavy coats typical of the 1920s and 30s. In multiple images, the men appeared to be examining architectural layouts or engineering plans. One photograph carried a handwritten date in the corner. The documents themselves were harder to read and far more unsettling. Many were written in fading ink on paper that had gone brittle with age, the kind of degradation you'd expect from decades of uncontrolled underground storage. Others were carbon copies, clearly produced on the kind of typewriters standard in government offices through the middle of the century. Several pages carried coded notations alongside partial lists of names and descriptions of events that didn't correspond to anything in any accessible public record. Some pages had been partially burned, edges charred and fragile, damage consistent with someone holding them briefly over a flame before abandoning the effort. Whatever that person had been trying to destroy, they never finished the job. The most heavily coated material showed the most concentrated burn damage, suggesting the destruction had been targeted rather than random, that someone had specifically tried to eliminate the coated records and had either been interrupted or simply given up before finishing. Scattered among the papers were metal instruments, drafting compasses, precision measuring tools, small mechanical components that resembled parts of early surveying equipment. Historians who study government infrastructure projects across the Southwest have noted that field engineers working on classified assignments in this region during periods of intense secretive development routinely carried exactly this kind of portable precision equipment. These weren't personal keepsakes, they were professional tools. Several of the pages were also written in a kind of private shorthand, abbreviated symbols and partial words that didn't match any standard cipher, but suggested someone had developed their own private method for recording information meant to be meaningless to anyone not specifically trained to read it. Tucked inside one of the sealed crates, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it in noticeably better condition than everything else in the room, investigators found a single folder. Its contents have never been made public. What has been confirmed is that this folder was removed from the property separately from every other piece of archival material and transported directly to a federal facility for examination. That folder is one of the things investigators have never discussed since the day they walked out of that library. But none of the documents, none of the photographs, none of the instruments or that sealed folder drew as much attention as the structure standing at the far end of the chamber. Because at the back wall, built directly into the stone, was an iron door, and it had been locked from the wrong side. The iron door did not belong to the same era as the tunnel around it. Its construction matched the reinforced vault doors installed in secure government facilities during the middle of the last century. Thick metal plating, large riveted hinges anchored directly into the surrounding stone with industrial permanence. Even after years underground in a damp, low-oxygen environment, the door remained structurally sound, built with a level of durability that had no obvious reason to exist inside a private residential property. The locking mechanism faced outward, toward the chamber where investigators were standing, which meant the door had been secured from the other side, from whatever existed beyond it, in a space that, as of now, has never been publicly confirmed or described by anyone involved. The closer the team examined that door, the stranger it got. The steel surface carried precise machining marks consistent with industrial fabrication rather than anything handcrafted on site, meaning it had been manufactured somewhere else entirely and installed here deliberately. Its thickness and reinforcement pattern matched vault-style doors used in mid-century secure installations, the kind designed to protect classified material from both forced entry and long-term environmental damage. The hinges were mounted on the interior side, a design detail found almost exclusively in bunker-style construction, where a door is built to withstand pressure, pushing outward rather than force coming in from the outside. Along the edges of the frame, investigators found traces of heavy rubber sealing material, the kind used specifically in airtight environments where controlling the atmosphere inside was a deliberate design requirement rather than an accident. Someone built this door to protect whatever sat on the other side of it, and whoever locked it last did so from the inside, which is exactly the detail that turns this from a strange discovery into something much harder to explain, especially once you connect it back to that laptop sitting open on the desk directly above. Now think about what that actually implies. Sitting right there next to a laptop full of Walter's private research, pointing straight down at this exact chamber. Northern New Mexico is not ordinary American countryside. It sits close to a region that, in the middle of the last century, became the operational center for some of the most classified engineering and scientific work in the country's history. Entire mountain communities were reshaped almost overnight. Roads were quietly removed from public maps. The area was placed under one of the most intensive security systems the country had ever built, and the work carried out there was designed from the very beginning never to be discussed. Records generated during that period entered classification systems that have only ever been released selectively, and a great deal of it remains sealed to this day. After the initial wave of activity ended, the secrecy didn't disappear, it evolved. Across the following decades, this same stretch of northern New Mexico became home to an expanding network of classified research facilities and underground installations, much of it never fully documented in any public record. Records that have been declassified over the years confirm that extensive underground construction did take place across this region during that period. Reinforced bunkers, hidden laboratories, protected storage chambers carved directly into the volcanic rock, using the natural geology of the area as shielding for sensitive equipment and materials. Some of those facilities were eventually dismantled properly. Others were simply sealed when the programs they supported quietly ended, and some just dropped out of active use entirely as layers of classification piled up and the people who remembered they existed slowly disappeared. Property across the surrounding region changed hands across generations, which means some structures built decades ago ended up, almost by accident, beneath land that was later sold off and developed for private residential use. Here's the question this story never fully answers. What if the tunnel underneath Walter Kessler's library was never built as some kind of eccentric private project at all? What if it originated decades earlier, back when this exact stretch of New Mexico was some of the most tightly controlled real estate in the entire country? That would explain why the oldest sections of the tunnel are built like a secure government installation instead of a residential basement. It would explain the vault-style door constructed to mid-century federal specifications. It would explain why the concealed entrance had been engineered directly into the architectural frame of the house with real mechanical precision. Not a simple padlock, not a basic hidden panel, but a purpose-built activation mechanism worked directly into the structure itself. And it would explain why, the moment investigators opened a laptop sitting on the desk directly above that passage, the case suddenly required a level of federal involvement that a routine natural death investigation should never have needed. So what was actually on that laptop? Here is what has been pieced together, described as carefully as the available information allows, since much of it remains unconfirmed by design. When investigators accessed the device sitting on Walter's library desk, what they found reportedly triggered a level of federal response far beyond anything a normal death inquiry would generate. People with knowledge of the broader investigation have suggested that the research material on that laptop connected directly to the contents of the underground chamber, that the two discoveries were not some strange coincidence, and that Walter had not simply inherited a hidden space beneath his house without understanding what it actually held. He had reportedly been researching it deliberately for years. The folder structure on the device apparently contained organized research files covering subjects that lined up closely with the historical period, represented by the documents found in that chamber below. Scanned photographs, typed summaries, cross-referenced timelines, and what looked like correspondence with historians, archivists, and at least one person connected to a federal records office. The kind of sustained, methodical work that takes months, if not years, to build, and requires a very clear sense of exactly what you are looking for. Now picture that library again, sitting directly above all of it. Hundreds of heavily annotated books on American history, Cold War-era infrastructure, and government secrecy programs, with handwritten notes filling the margins of page after page. This was never the research shelf of someone casually interested in old history. This looked like an active, ongoing investigation, carried out for years, in the one room sitting directly above a hidden passage, by a man who had apparently spent decades quietly building relationships with historians and archivists who had access to records most people would never be able to reach. People who knew Walter later described his research habits as patient, meticulous, and almost stubborn. Someone who always pushed for primary sources instead of secondhand summaries, who contacted archives directly rather than accepting that something simply wasn't available, and who kept pulling on a thread until it either broke or led somewhere new. That kind of approach, sustained over 2 decades inside a house sitting directly above a concealed tunnel connected to what looks like a classified archive, does not read like the behavior of someone who stumbled onto something by accident. It reads like a man quietly building a case, piecing together a timeline, trying to confirm exactly what was sitting underneath the floor of his own home, and what it actually meant about the history of that land, that region, and the era that built it in the first place. No official statement has ever addressed the full scope of what was found beneath the Kessler property, at least not in this story, and that's worth sitting with for a moment. The underground chamber has never been cataloged publicly. The iron door has never been mentioned in any official statement. The connection between the laptop files and the chamber below has never been confirmed or denied by anyone in a position to know. When people asked for clarification about the federal side of the investigation, they were reportedly redirected back to statements addressing only the causes of death, leaving every other question about the property completely unanswered. That kind of silence tends to say something on its own. Investigations that wrap up, cleanly get closed and explained. They don't usually involve extended federal sweeps and the quiet removal of material from an underground chamber that, according to every public record, was never supposed to exist in the first place, followed by months of complete institutional silence afterward. Walter may have been the first owner of that property who actually understood what was sitting beneath it. Whether he discovered the passage by accident and then spent years working backward from what it contained, or whether he built his entire quiet retirement around slowly investigating it on purpose, is something only the contents of those laptop files could really answer. And somewhere beyond an iron door, locked from the inside, built to old government vault specifications, sealed beneath the floor of a dead man's private library, there is a room that has been waiting a very long time for someone to finally open it. To be completely clear, this story is a work of fiction. Walter and Elena Kessler are not real people, and no such investigation has ever taken place. But the details woven through this story, the underground bunkers built across northern New Mexico during the middle of the last century, the extensive classified infrastructure hidden beneath the region's mountains, the property records that quietly changed hands across generations without anyone fully knowing what sat beneath the surface, all of that is grounded in real, documented history. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath ordinary-looking homes and quiet stretches of desert land, structures like this genuinely do exist, sealed shut, waiting, mostly forgotten. If a story like this pulled you in, make sure you are subscribed, because there are dozens more hidden history mysteries just like this one waiting to be told, and the next one might be even harder to put down than this.